The thing about mysteries is that everyone thinks they want to solve them until they actually do. Research station Kepler 7 floated in the neutral zone like a very expensive question mark, bristling with sensors that asked uncomfortable queries about a dead empire. The Kethvar had ruled 12 sectors for 3 millennia before something turned their entire civilization into archaeological evidence practically overnight. Now, representatives from 6 species poked at the remains like students dissecting a particularly revolting specimen, each convinced they held the key to understanding what had gone so catastrophically wrong. Dr. Zara Okafor found the whole arrangement exhausting. The cellular degradation patterns are inconsistent with any known pathogenic mechanism, she announced to the conference room, watching alien faces arrange themselves into expressions of polite skepticism. We're looking at targeted systemic failure that somehow avoided every single countermeasure the Kethvar deployed. Commander Vexthal, whose species had evolved from something that probably ate its young for sport, clicked his mandibles in what passed for amusement among the hegemony. Countermeasures? Doctor, the Kethvar medical technology was primitive compared to modern standards. Their collapse was inevitable. Research Director Chintar, who resembled a cross between a bureaucrat and a houseplant, rustled his fronds diplomatically. Commander, perhaps we should examine all possibilities before drawing conclusions. Of course, Vexthal's translation matrix rendered his tone with mechanical precision, though Okafor suspected the original contained several untranslatable insults. I defer to our scientific colleagues. Even our human colleague, limited though her species' medical understanding may be. Okafor had heard variations of the song before. Humans, according to galactic consensus, approach medicine like barbarians approaches surgery, with enthusiasm and crude instruments, while other species had developed precise molecular therapies that could target individual cellular components. Humans still relied on broad-spectrum approaches that treated symptoms rather than underlying mechanisms. It was considered charmingly primitive, like watching someone try to perform microsurgery with a hammer. Commander, she said, her voice carrying particular patience reserved for explaining obvious things to obtuse people. The Kethvar didn't fall because their medicine was primitive. They fell because something specifically designed to counter advanced medical intervention killed them. Designed, Dr. Yilneth, the consortium's representative, extended several eye stalks in what might have been surprise or indigestion. You're suggesting this plague was artificial? I'm suggesting. Okafor pulled up the holographic display showing tissue samples that look like biological abstract art. That natural selection doesn't typically produce pathogens with built-in resistance to treatments that wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. The room fell into a particular variety of silence that accompanies someone saying something either brilliant or insane. In Okafor's experience, the distinction was often academic. Vexthal leaned back in his chair, which had been specifically designed to accommodate his species' unfortunate tendency toward excessive spinal protrusions. Dr. Okafor, with respect, you're a xenobiologist specializing in comparative anatomy. Epidemiology requires a more sophisticated understanding of pathogenic evolution than what? Than a human can manage. Okafor's smile could have been used to etch glass. How refreshing. I was wondering when we get to the part where someone explains how my inferior primate brain couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of the situation. I never said. You didn't have to. She gestured toward the display, where cellular breakdown patterns formed geometric shapes that violated several basic principles of organic chemistry. You see primitive medicine where I see evidence of weaponized biology. You see inevitable collapse where I see precision targeting. The question is, which one of us is actually looking at the data? Dr. Yilneth's eye stalks swiveled nervously between them. Perhaps we should focus on the research rather than theoretical frameworks. Theoretical? Okafor laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both pleasant and threatening. Commander Vexthal just spent 10 minutes explaining how the Kethvar died because they lacked proper medical technology. Meanwhile, I'm looking at tissue samples that show complete immune system shutdown followed by organ failure that specifically avoided triggering any of their automated medical responses. That's not theoretical, that's engineered. Sheen Tar rustled anxiously. Dr. Okafor, surely you're not suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. This pathogen bypassed Kethvar medical countermeasures with surgical precision. It left their technology intact while killing every single member of their species. And most importantly, she highlighted a section of the cellular analysis. It did so using mechanisms that would be completely vulnerable to the kind of broad-spectrum treatment approaches that other species consider primitive. The silence stretched like a rubber band, approaching its breaking point. You're saying... Vexthal's voice carried the tone of someone working through an unpleasant realization that whoever created this plague specifically designed it to exploit advanced medical technology. I'm saying that whoever created this plague understood that sometimes the most sophisticated defense can become the most exploitable weakness. Okafor closed the display with a gesture that suggested the conversation was over whether anyone else thought so or not. The Kethvar died because their medicine was too good, too precise, too narrowly focused. They couldn't adapt to something that required a broader, less elegant approach. Less elegant, Vexthal repeated slowly. Like human medicine. Like human medicine, she agreed. Crude, imprecise, and apparently immune to whatever killed an entire galactic empire. The commander's mandibles clicked in a pattern that definitely didn't translate to amusement. You're just a medic, doctor. You can't possibly understand the strategic implications of what you're suggesting. Okafor gathered her materials with the calm efficiency of someone who had just won an argument that everyone else was still trying to understand. You're right, Commander. I'm just a medic. But so was whoever designed the cure that turned the mighty Kethvar Empire into a footnote in galactic history. She left them sitting in the conference room, probably wondering if she just threatened them or simply stated an uncomfortable truth. From her perspective, the distinction was becoming increasingly academic. After all, the best mysteries weren't the ones you solved. They were the ones that solved you. 3 days later, Okafor found herself descending into what had once been the crown jewel of Kethvar medical research. Assuming crown jewels typically resemble blast furnace caverns filled with a lingering scent of institutional despair, the expedition to vault complex data 7 had been Sheen Tar's idea, though he'd managed to phrase it as a collaborative decision in a way that administrators everywhere had perfected into an art form. Preliminary scans indicate the data core survived the initial catastrophe, announced Dr. Kesral, the team's archaeological specialist, whose species had evolved from creatures that apparently stored information in their armpit equivalents. However, the access protocols may prove challenging. Vexthal, who had volunteered for the expedition with the enthusiasm of someone attending his own execution, adjusted his environmental suit's atmospheric mixture. Challenging how exactly? The Kethvar employed biological encryption keys, Kesral explained, consulting a device that beeped ominously at regular intervals. The archives will only open for someone carrying specific genetic markers. Genetic markers from a completely extinct species, Okafor observed, examining the vault entrance that looked like the mouth of something that had died badly. How delightfully convenient. Actually, Kesral's voice carried the particular smugness of someone about to deliver unwelcome news. The markers aren't species-specific. They're profession-specific. Medical personnel, to be precise. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Vexthal, whose mandibles had developed what appeared to be a permanent twitch since their last conversation. 2 hours of technological archaeology later, they stood before a data core that hummed with a particular frequency of information that nobody really wanted to know. The Kethvar had been thorough record keepers. which meant their final medical logs contained enough detail to make even seasoned xenobiologists question their career choices. Patient 007 shows initial symptoms consistent with cellular membrane degradation. Okafor read from the translated files, her voice echoing strangely in the vault's acoustics. Standard immunobooster protocols initiated. No response. Advanced targeted therapy commenced. Condition deteriorated. Standard procedure, Vexthal commented. Though he sounded less certain than usual, they would naturally escalate to more sophisticated treatments. Patient 0014 exhibits identical symptom progression, she continued, scrolling through records that painted a picture of systematic medical failure. Nanoscale intervention attempted, genetic therapy deployed, quantum cellular repair initiated. All treatments proved ineffective. Dr. Kesral's environmental suit rustled nervously. They tried everything in their medical arsenal. Not everything. Okafor highlighted a section of the records that made everyone lean closer to their displays. Look at this notation from Chief Medical Researcher Thekval. Attempting primitive broad-spectrum approach as final resort. Historical records suggest less advanced species might employ such methods. The silence in the vault carried weight that had nothing to do with atmospheric pressure. They tried our methods, Vexthal said slowly, as if speaking the words might make them less true. Human medical approaches. And failed spectacularly, Okafor confirmed, pulling up the final medical logs. Every attempt at broad-spectrum treatment resulted in accelerated deterioration. The pathogen seemed to anticipate and counter their efforts to treat symptoms rather than underlying mechanisms. Dr. Kesral's scanner began beeping more urgently. This suggests a level of sophistication that borders on prescience. How could any biological agent predict therapeutic approaches? Unless, Okafor said, her voice carrying the tone of someone following a logic chain to its unpleasant conclusion. It wasn't predicting. It was programmed. She pulled up another file, this one containing what appeared to be the final desperate communications from Kethvar medical facilities across their empire. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Every advanced medical intervention had not only failed, but seemed to accelerate the plague's progression. Medical log final entry facility prime. She read aloud. Chief Researcher Vexnal recording. We have documented complete therapeutic failure across all intervention protocols. Most disturbing is the pathogen's apparent ability to weaponize our own medical technology against us. Nanoscale repair systems become vectors for cellular destruction. Genetic therapy protocols trigger cascade failures. Even basic immune enhancement results in autoimmune catastrophe. Vexthal's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. That's impossible. Medical technology doesn't work that way. Advanced medical technology doesn't work that way. Okafor corrected, but apparently, this pathogen was designed specifically to turn sophisticated medicine into a suicide mechanism. The archaeological scanner in Kesral's hands had progressed from beeping to making sounds that suggested it was having an existential crisis. Dr. Okafor, I'm detecting similar biomarkers in the vault atmosphere. Dormant but present. Dormant for now, she agreed, checking her own scanner readings. But given that we've got representatives from multiple species down here, all carrying advanced medical support systems, the implication hung in the recycled air like a particularly unwelcome dinner guest. We need to leave, Vexthal announced, though his voice lacked its usual commanding certainty. Immediately, we need to understand, Okafor countered, downloading the complete medical database with the kind of urgency usually reserved for escaping burning buildings. This pathogen didn't just kill the Kethvar. It was specifically engineered to kill anyone who fought it with advanced medicine. And what about those who fight it with primitive medicine? Dr. Kesral asked, though they all suspected the answer. Okafor finished her download and sealed the data core, her movements carrying the precision of someone who had just solved part of a puzzle and discovered it was larger and more unpleasant than expected. According to these records, the Kefvar never encountered anyone who survived long enough to try truly primitive approaches. Everyone they contacted used medical technology sophisticated enough to trigger the pathogen's countermeasures. Everyone except humans, Vexthal said quietly. Everyone except humans, she confirmed. Which raises the question of why a pathogen will be designed to spare the one species in the galaxy whose medical approaches are considered fundamentally backwards. As they began their ascent from the vault, Dr. Kestrel's scanner erupted into the kind of alarm chittering that universal translators rendered as various creative expletives. Biomarker activation detected. The dormant pathogens are responding to our presence. How long do we have? Vexthal demanded, his military training overriding whatever existential crisis he might be experiencing. Based on Kefvar medical logs, Okafor consulted the data she'd just downloaded. Approximately 6 hours before symptoms manifest, 12 hours before advanced medical intervention becomes actively lethal, they climb toward the surface in silence, each absorbed in their own uncomfortable realizations. The Kefvar hadn't just died from a plague. They'd died from a weapon specifically designed to exploit their medical sophistication. And now that same weapon was waking up in response to a research team carrying exactly the kind of advanced medical technology that had proven fatal 3 centuries earlier. Dr. Okafor, Vexthal called as they reached the vault entrance, his voice carrying a tone she'd never heard from him before. When you said someone designed this pathogen to spare humans, you meant spare, not target, correct? She paused at the threshold between the dead Empire's tomb and the questionable safety of the surface, considering the weight of her answer. Commander, at this point, I'm not entirely sure there's a difference. The medical bay of Research Station Kepler-7 had transformed into something resembling a very expensive panic room, complete with quarantine fields that hummed with the particular desperation of technology trying to solve problems it wasn't designed for. Dr. Yilnef lay connected to a consortium medical unit that beeped with increasing urgency, while Director Chintar's Franz had taken on an alarming shade of beige that indicated a species was approaching systemic shutdown. Molecular reconstruction therapy shows no efficacy, reported the station's chief medical officer, a being whose name contained 17 syllables and whose competence was currently being questioned by a pathogen that apparently held advanced degrees in biological warfare. Cellular regeneration protocols are actively accelerating tissue breakdown. Okafor stood at the observation window, watching the medical bay's sophisticated equipment fail with the kind of systematic precision that suggested malicious intent. Turn it off. Excuse me? The medical officer's translation matrix rendered their confusion with mechanical precision. All of it. The regeneration systems, the molecular therapy, the immune enhancement protocols. Turn off every piece of advanced medical technology in that room. Commander Vexthal, who had been maintaining a respectful distance from anything that might be contagious, moved closer to the window. Doctor, that would be essentially condemning them to death. No, Commander. Continuing current treatment protocols is condemning them to death. What I'm suggesting might actually keep them alive long enough for us to try something different. The medical officer's species lacked the biological capacity for sputtering, but they manage a reasonable approximation. Different? Dr. Okafor. We're employing the most advanced therapeutic interventions available. There is nothing more sophisticated we can deploy. Exactly the problem, she muttered, pulling up her portable medical kit, a collection of instruments that most galactic physicians would have recognized as museum pieces. Sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the wrong solution. She sealed her environmental suit and entered the quarantine chamber, carrying equipment that represented 3 centuries of deliberately unsophisticated human medical development The contrast with the room's gleaming alien technology was almost comical, like bringing a wooden spoon to a molecular gastronomy competition. Okafor, Vexthol's voice crackled through the comm system. What are you doing? Something that should have been tried first instead of last, she replied, approaching Dr. Yilneth with a device that looked suspiciously like it might have been assembled from spare parts. I'm going to treat symptoms instead of trying to cure the underlying pathogen. That's backwards. The medical officer protested. Standard protocol requires identifying and neutralizing an infectious agent before addressing secondary effects. Standard protocol got the Kethvar killed, Okafor observed, beginning what appeared to be a surprisingly mundane medical examination. Let's try non-standard protocol and see if we can avoid adding 3 more species to the extinct category. Her approach was aggressively simple. Monitoring vital signs with basic instruments, administering broad-spectrum support for failing organ systems, treating fever and inflammation without attempting to understand their underlying mechanisms. It was a kind of medicine that other species had abandoned centuries ago in favor of more elegant solutions. Cellular degradation is slowing, the medical officer announced, their voice carrying the tone of someone reporting something that violated several fundamental principles of biology. Immune response is stabilizing, added another technician, whose species apparently expressed surprise through color changes that translated poorly over comm systems. Vexthol pressed closer to the observation window. How is that possible? Because Okafor continued her decidedly low-tech intervention. This pathogen was designed to exploit the sophisticated feedback mechanisms that advanced medical systems rely on. Every time our equipment tries to identify and counter specific biological processes, the pathogen adapts and uses those same processes as weapons. She moved the director Chintar, whose fronds had begun showing the first signs of recovering their normal verdant hue. But if you don't try to fight the pathogen directly, if you just support the patient's basic biological functions without attempting precision intervention, there's nothing for it to exploit. You're saying? The medical officer spoke slowly, as if testing each word for structural integrity, that the pathogen can only weaponize sophisticated medical responses? I'm saying this pathogen is like a martial artist who specializes in using an opponent's strength against them. The more advanced your attack, the more effectively they can counter it. But if you don't attack at all, if you just maintain basic defense. Dr. Yilneth's eye stalks began moving independently for the first time in hours, a sign that their species interpreted as either recovery or the onset of complete neurological breakdown. In this case, Okafor hoped for the former. The Kethvar records, Vexthol said suddenly. They mentioned that broad-spectrum approaches failed when they tried them. The Kethvar tried to adapt their advanced systems to mimic broad-spectrum approaches. Okafor corrected, monitoring vital signs with instruments that wouldn't have looked out of place in a pre-space civilization. That's not the same thing. They were still using sophisticated delivery mechanisms, precise dosage calculations, targeted cellular interfaces, all of which gave the pathogen vectors to exploit. She gestured toward her collection of primitive medical equipment. This is genuinely unsophisticated medicine. No precision targeting, no molecular-level intervention, no attempt to understand the pathogen's mechanisms. Just basic life support and symptomatic treatment. Basic, Vexthol repeated, as if the word tasted strange. You're saying that medical primitivism is actually a tactical advantage. I'm saying that whoever designed this weapon understood that the galaxy's greatest strength could become its greatest weakness. Advanced civilizations develop advanced medicine. Advanced medicine relies on sophisticated systems. Sophisticated systems can be turned against themselves. Director Chintar's fronds rustled weakly, but the sound was music compared to the alarming silence that had preceded it. But humans never developed such sophisticated systems. Humans develop sophisticated systems, Okafor confirmed. But we never abandoned the unsophisticated ones. We kept the crude approaches as backup, as training tools, as emergency alternatives. Most species consider that redundant, inefficient, primitive. And now that primitivism is the only thing standing between us and extinction, the medical officer observed, their tone carrying new respect for concepts they had previously dismissed. Not extinction, Okafor corrected, checking her patient's responses with the satisfaction of someone whose supposedly inferior methods were proving remarkably effective. Just a very expensive lesson in the dangers of assuming that more advanced always means better. Outside the quarantine chamber, alarms began sounding throughout the station. Other research teams, returning from various expedition sites, were beginning to show symptoms. The pathogen was spreading, carried by personnel whose advanced life support systems had already begun the process of turning sophisticated medicine into sophisticated suicide. How many people can you treat this way? Vexthal asked, watching more medical teams rush toward quarantine chambers equipped with technology that might kill their patients faster than the disease would. Okafor considered the question while monitoring 3 patients whose lives now depended on medical approaches that the rest of the galaxy had dismissed as hopelessly backward. As many as are willing to trust their lives to a primitive human medic using obsolete equipment and outdated procedures. And if they're not willing, she glanced toward the observation window, where Vexthal stood watching controlled chaos of a medical crisis that could only be solved by abandoning everything that modern medicine had taught them to value. The command center of Research Station Kepler-7 had been transformed into something resembling a war room. If wars were typically fought against microscopic enemies that possessed a disturbing sense of tactical planning, emergency broadcasts flickered across multiple screens, each one documenting the spread of what was being called the Kethvar Revival, a name that suggested either optimism or a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. 17 stations have gone dark, reported Captain Mordak, whose species had evolved from pack hunters and retained an unfortunate tendency to assume every problem required teeth. The Hegemony High Command is demanding immediate quarantine protocols for all human personnel. Vexthal, who had spent the last 12 hours watching his worldview undergo systematic deconstruction, managed what might have been laughter if his species possessed the necessary anatomical equipment. Captain, at this point, quarantining the humans would be roughly equivalent to throwing away the only functioning life preservers on a sinking ship. Okafor stood before a holographic display that showed the plague progression across 17 star systems, each blinking red, representing worlds where advanced medical technology had become an instrument of species-wide suicide. The pattern is accelerating. Every attempt at sophisticated intervention creates new vectors for transmission. Dr. Okafor, Director Chintar's recovered Franz rustled with nervous energy. The Galactic Medical Council is requesting your immediate consultation on treatment protocols. They're asking for instructions on how to practice primitive medicine. Primitive medicine, she repeated, her voice carrying undertones that suggested the phrase had acquired new meaning over the last few days. Is that what we're calling it? Captain Mordak's predatory features arranged themselves into what his species probably considered diplomacy. Doctor, with respect, terminology seems less important than preventing galactic extinction. Can your methods be adapted for mass deployment? My methods. Okafor highlighted sections of the galactic infection map with movements that seemed almost casual, were already adapted for mass deployment. About 3 centuries ago, the command center fell into a particular variety of silence that accompanies someone saying something that recontextualizes everything that came before it. In this case, the recontextualization was comprehensive and deeply uncomfortable. 3 centuries, Vexthal said slowly, his mandibles clicking in patterns that definitely didn't translate to amusement. The first contact period. The period when humans first encountered galactic civilization. Okafor confirmed. pulling up historical records that have been carefully archived and apparently forgotten by everyone except human military medical historians. The period when humanity was introduced to species possessing medical technology that made our approaches look like ceremonial bloodletting. She gestured toward the display, where infection vectors formed patterns that seemed almost too systematic to be accidental. The period when human colonial medical corps units were deployed to every major contact zone, ostensibly to provide emergency medical support for human personnel who might not be compatible with alien medical systems. Captain Mordak's hunting instincts were apparently sharp enough to recognize a predator, even when it wore the disguise of a healer. Ostensibly, human military doctrine has always emphasized redundancy, Okafor explained, calling up files that carried security classifications suggesting they had been secrets until very recently. Medical redundancy, specifically, the ability to provide effective treatment even when sophisticated systems are unavailable, compromised, or actively hostile. The implications spread to a command center like ripples in a pond, each one carrying increasingly uncomfortable realizations. The pathogen, Director Chintar's voice barely registered above a whisper, was designed by humans. The pathogen was designed by human military medics, Okafor corrected, who understood that in any potential conflict with technologically superior species, conventional weapons would be ineffective, but biological weapons that specifically targeted the enemy's medical advantages, that turned their greatest strength into their most exploitable weakness. She pulled up deployment records that painted a picture of systematic preparation disguised as humanitarian mission planning. Colonial Medical Corps units weren't just providing backup medical support. They were conducting the largest field test in biological warfare history, deploying weapons that would remain dormant until activated by the specific conditions of advanced medical intervention. Vexthol's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. The Kefar Empire fell because they encountered a human medical weapon. The Kefar Empire fell because they made the mistake of treating human medical personnel as primitives rather than strategists, Okafor clarified. They assumed that anyone practicing crude medicine must be harmless. They never considered that the crudeness might be deliberately maintained as camouflage. Captain Mordak's predatory instincts were now operating at full alert. How many species have encountered these weapons? According to deployment records, every major galactic power has had contact with human medical corps personnel over the last 3 centuries. Every species that considered human medicine primitive and irrelevant has been exposed to dormant biological agents that activate in response to the kind of sophisticated medical intervention that defines advanced civilization. The command center's displays now showed not just the current outbreak, but historical patterns of contact between human medical units and alien populations. The coverage was comprehensive, systematic, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. This is genocide, Captain Mordak stated flatly. This is insurance, Okafor countered. Genocide would involve activating the weapons indiscriminately. What you're seeing is a defensive system that only triggers when humans are threatened by species whose medical technology could be turned against human populations. And who determines when humans are threatened? Director Chintar asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer. The weapons themselves, apparently. They're designed to activate when exposed to medical technology sophisticated enough to pose a threat to human biological security, which means, she gestured toward the infection map, that every current outbreak began when research teams attempted to study Kefar remains using exactly the kind of advanced medical analysis that the weapons were programmed to counter. Vexthol stood motionless for several moments, processing information that fundamentally altered his understanding of humanity's place in galactic civilization. You're saying that human medical inferiority was a deliberate deception. I'm saying that human medical philosophy was a deliberate choice, Okafor replied. We maintain crude, broad-spectrum approaches not because we couldn't develop sophisticated systems, but because we understood the strategic value of maintaining methods that couldn't be exploited by our own weapons. And now, Captain Mordak demanded, now that the secret is revealed, Okafor considered the question, while studying displays that showed the galaxy's most advanced civilizations being systematically crippled by biological agents that specifically targeted their medical sophistication. Now we find out whether the galaxy prefers to survive or to maintain its technological pride. She turned toward the communication array, her movements carrying the finality of someone making a decision that would reshape Interstellar's relations for centuries to come. This is Dr. Zara Okafor, Human Colonial Medical Corps, to all affected systems. Effective immediately, I am assuming medical authority for all plague response operations. Standard treatment protocols are hereby suspended. All personnel will submit to human medical supervision using human-approved equipment and procedures. And if they refuse, Vexthal asked quietly, then they'll discover what the Kethvar learned 3 centuries ago. She replied, activating the transmission protocols that would carry her message across 17 star systems where advanced civilizations were learning the hard way that sometimes the most primitive solution was the only solution that worked. Sometimes a medic you dismiss as crude and backwards is the only thing standing between your species and extinction. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the command center. The galaxy had spent centuries patronizing human medical practices, treating them as charming anachronisms maintained by a species too primitive to develop proper health care. Now those same practices represented the difference between survival and species-wide suicide. Commander Vexthal, Okafor called as she prepared to coordinate the largest medical crisis in galactic history, using methods that most civilizations had abandoned before achieving spaceflight. You said I was just a medic. His mandibles clicked once, a sound that his translation matrix rendered as something between acknowledgement and surrender. I did. You were right, she confirmed, beginning the process of teaching advanced civilizations how to practice medicine like barbarians in order to save their lives. The question is whether that's a weakness or the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Outside the command center's windows, ships from a dozen species were already requesting permission to dock, their crews desperate for treatment from medical personnel they had previously dismissed as primitives. The galaxy's most sophisticated civilizations were learning to line up for help from doctors whose greatest qualification was their stubborn refusal to be sophisticated. It was, Okafor reflected, probably not how anyone had expected the balance of galactic power to shift. But then again, the best strategies were usually the ones nobody saw coming. Hashtag, he said, you're just a medic. She said, so was the Curer that killed their army.